Afternoon. It's my pleasure to be speaking here today, and I want to thank the organisers for inviting me. My name is Lorraine Morgan. I work with LERO, the Irish Software Engineering Research Centre based at the National University of Ireland in Galway. Just to give you a bit of background, we work with a number of companies around open innovation, open source software, business models, and more recently cloud computing. So we've conducted a number of studies around, the business value of cloud computing and factors affecting adoption. So we work with both service providers and customers. I suppose in our discussions with kind of industry to date, one of their biggest concerns is how to adopt cloud computing and what are the factors that they need to consider in adopting cloud computing. So this is kind of the purpose of the study. We've done a number of case studies and field studies around adoption of cloud computing, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm not going to really define cloud computing. I'm sure between yesterday and today you have a fairly good idea. What we found when we kind of conducted a little review around cloud computing is that, many of the definitions of cloud computing, they're quite vague and multidimensional, and there's no single universal accepted definition of cloud computing. But the National Institute of Standards and Technology, they have come up with a fairly comprehensive definition of cloud computing. So I suppose this one kind of encompasses all aspects of cloud computing. So you've got 4 deployment models: private, community, public, and hybrid. The 3 service models, so software, infrastructure, and platform as a service. And 5 characteristics that make it very, very attractive to organizations: on-demand self-service, broad network access, resource pooling, elasticity, and measured service. So it's primarily those characteristics that interest organizations and form the foundation as to why they want to know more about adopting cloud computing. So the motivation for our study, we know that cloud computing has the potential to transform a large part of the IT industry. So we know it's a catalyst for innovation. It's become cheaper, more ubiquitous, and so on, and organizations are, very, very interested, but a little bit they're not very well educated on cloud computing. So there's massive motivation for adopting it, but to date there's very little empirical research on the adoption of cloud services. What we found is most of the existing literature tends to focus on technical issues and less so on adoption issues, which makes it difficult for companies to adopt. So before I kind of go into some of the findings, a lot of the evidence around cloud computing adoption is quite anecdotal. Okay, we're seeing more and more studies around adoption and business value of cloud computing, but it's still very, very limited. And when we talk about cloud computing adoption, the literature hasn't really used an innovation adoption framework. So we decided to use Tornatsky and Fleischer's adoption framework because we were very interested in looking at the organizational level. Most adoption studies focus on the individual level and fail to take into consideration the business or the environmental context. So we looked at the technological characteristics that facilitate or constrain cloud computing adoption. So we looked at things like relative advantage. So is the innovation that you're adopting, is it better than the idea it supersedes? Is it compatible with existing technologies, norms and values? Is it difficult to use? Is it complex? Trialability is how can you conduct pilot studies? Can you conduct trials? And observability is, are the results of adopting the innovation, are they visible to technology adopters? So we looked at those different technology characteristics. We also tried to focus on organizational factors that impacted adoption. So we looked at kind of the structures, relationships, processes of an organization. And we took into consideration the environmental context, where we looked at kind of regulations, competitors, and the industry in which the organization operates. So, as I said, the purpose was to investigate the factors that impact cloud adoption. So we looked at the technological, organizational, and environmental factors that impacted adoption. So we conducted several case studies, and we took the perspective of the service providers and their customers. Now, many of you are probably wondering, why do we talk to service providers? We felt that they could provide us with a very good kind of overall view of the benefits of cloud computing because of their interactions with customers. And customers themselves kind of give us a good idea of the benefits and challenges of cloud computing adoption. So today I'm kind of going to talk about 3 case studies that we conducted. We've done, I suppose, 5 or 6 in total, and we have conducted a field study. So the first case study, we interviewed some people in SourceDog. SourceDog are a new kind of startup firm. They started up business in 2012, and they kind of focus on procurement software. So they have they provide an e-sourcing solution, also called SourceDog. And we talked to 2 of their customers, the Irish Blood Transfusion Board, which is a public sector body, and APM, another food and drink public sector body. So they use SourceDog in their procurement environment. We talked to AD Networks, and they provide IT and networking solutions to a number of companies. They're based in the UK. And we talked to a customer. We conducted some interviews with a customer of theirs called Information Mosaic, and they work in the financial market. They provide software applications to a lot of the banking sector and so on. And the final case study then looked at Almir Consultancy. So they kind of provide consultancy around quality, health, and they help kind of companies with their ISO standards. So a customer of theirs was NDC. They operate primarily in the electronics industry, where they provide highly customized GPS tracking devices to businesses in over 30 countries. So they're kind of the kind of sum up the service providers and their customers. And I want to just report on some of the findings. So in terms of the technological factors, we found that one factor indeed was relative advantage. So companies seen a huge benefit in terms of software and hardware costs. So what we found was that it kind of really drives down costs. Companies like Information Mosaic, they've kind of invested heavily in the past on servers, which costs in the region of 12,000 to 13,000 euro. They were kind of able to eliminate that cost. They were able to save on kind of overhead costs like maintenance, electricity, and so on. Excuse me, and so on. Scalability was another cited benefit, so they could provide services ad hoc on a scale that was needed, and they could start with one server and keep going and going. And time savings, so there was faster implementation time. So if you compare implementing a cloud system to a traditional IT system, some of the companies, those that even use SourceDog, they could implement the system. They were up and running in 24 hours. And they compared this to kind of 6 months for a traditional IT system implementation. Compatibility was another factor. One benefit that was cited was the ability to streamline and improve internal processes. And I just include a quotation there. So a lot of the online and cloud tools are much easier to bespoke yourself and to continually update as you change your business. So improving internal processes was a highly cited benefit. But there are some challenges around compatibility, and one challenge is integration. So integrating with IT systems like an enterprise resource planning system can be problematic. But what service providers, what they mentioned was that, you know, if they aim to integrate directly with existing IT systems, they're moving away from their core value proposition, and that is to have customers up and running in 24 hours. Bandwidth and connectivity was another cited challenge. I should have mentioned that most of the customers in the study, cloud adoption is very much at pilot phase. So if they want to move, you know, more and more data to the cloud, bandwidth and connectivity will be an issue. And this is as important to them as the performance of the system. So there was a lot of issues around integration, bandwidth and connectivity, and this was something that was cited throughout the interviews. In terms of complexity then, well, most of the service providers will kind of, told us, well, cloud systems are very simple to use. We simply, send on login details, and, they're very, they're very user friendly. That's okay if you know how cloud technologies work. For the average user, and this is always the case with adoption of any innovation, there's always fear and there's always uncertainty and there's always doubt about any new innovation. So training and hand-holding is very important, especially at the outset of cloud adoption. So a lot of service providers provide webinars and various training seminars. But what we found is that, service providers, they need to build systems that are intuitive to user needs, okay? So people already know how they like to operate. If you can make the system intuitive, they don't have to go and pick up a manual every time they turn on the screen. So, again, for some users, they can be quite complex. For others, very, very straightforward. And trialability was very important. So the ability to carry out pilot studies and various trials. Prior to cloud adoption, most of the customers in the study engaged in feasibility studies, and feasibility studies were extremely important because, cloud service providers, what they've told us is that, not everyone is suited to the cloud. The purpose of the feasibility study was to establish whether customers should, adopt cloud computing or not. So pilot studies and trials were very, very important. Observability didn't come into it because, as I said, cloud adoption was very, very much at the pilot phase. So the results weren't, they weren't very visible. In terms of organizational factors that impacted adoption, I suppose one interesting finding was the fact that cloud computing has the ability to improve collaboration and promote openness. This was something as well that was frequently cited throughout the various studies, because there's, with cloud adoption, there's more transparency, there's more team engagement, there's more communication, there's more collaboration tools. So many of the organizations use wikis, where users can update their profiles, and they can inform people if they're going to be away or if they're in meetings and so on. So what the companies were finding is that they had sort of an internal Facebook of sorts with cloud adoption. So that was just another quotation that I included from one of the customers in the study, so we can all go in and just see what's going on. When people know what's going on, they feel they are part of something. So the ability kind of to improve collaboration was a frequently cited organizational factor. And interestingly, one of the service providers in the study, he mentioned that we're really only at the cloud 1.0 stage. We've yet to reach the cloud 2.0 stage, and that will be about connectivity and about collaboration and about open innovation. But we've yet to see that. Increased traceability and auditability was another one. So again, there's, the ability to be able to track the location and history of the data is very, very important. Many of the customers in the study have, have heavy audits every year, so traceability was hugely important. And for service providers, they need to demonstrate transparency and integrity because their customers are demanding it. So another quotation, transparency and integrity are very important with public and private sector bodies. And as I said, service providers need to demonstrate that they're doing things properly. So I suppose one of the biggest challenges that we found, one of the biggest organizational challenges impacting adoption was IT managers' fear of losing control of their IT environment. And this is a big barrier to cloud adoption. For the service providers in the study, they felt that they were able to justify everything their cloud system could do. So they had met with IT managers, they had conducted feasibility studies, but they said cloud adoption was blocked in that respective company for all the wrong reasons. And mostly because, IT managers, they like to be in charge, they like to see the physical box, they don't like the idea of cloud, everything that's included in that quotation there, and they have a lot of responsibilities. So what if it breaks? Where are we left then? So there's an attitude, if it ain't broken, why fix it? So IT managers, what we found, they block adoption of cloud computing to a great extent. So there needs to be trust in service providers' ability to respond. Now, most of the service providers in the case studies, they work a lot of out of office hours. They're always on call. Remember, some of them are startup companies, so they really want to kind of retain the customers that they have. So they do an awful lot of out of office calls and so on. But what service providers when we ask them about, managers losing control of their IT environment, or, in some cases they will actually lose their jobs. What service providers feel is that if they adjust their skills to suit the cloud landscape, they will be okay. That there is a lot of new positions arising with cloud adoption. So IT managers, this was a big one for us, and again, something that was frequently cited. It was actually bigger than security and legal issues, would you believe? Which is a very, very important factor for adoption. So I suppose, companies want to know where their data is being held. They have huge issues around data confidentiality, and if there's a disaster, a lot of their data fails over to another data center, and often ends up in a jurisdiction where they don't want their data to be. But again, one service provider came back with this quotation. He said, clients need to examine exactly what they are doing now to see if it is any more secure than what vendors are proposing in relation to cloud technologies. So what they're saying is security isn't a cloud issue. It's just a security issue. So I mean, if you build a bigger safe, there's always someone there to try and crack that safe. So firms that are thinking about implementing a cloud system, they should start with a non-mission critical application or a lightweight application. So if the cloud system crashed, if the cloud crashed, would your business crumble? These are questions that you need to ask yourself. So start with something that isn't mission critical to the organization, and if it works, take it from there. And just start off lightly, start off incrementally. I suppose the biggest environmental challenge was the lack of cloud standards. Now, we had a workshop there about 2 weeks ago, and we had 60 industry participants, and they talked an awful lot about the lack of new cloud standards. And this is something that needs to be addressed, and I think it is really being addressed even at an EU level. So as one customer said, if a hosting company takes my business, I would expect to see that they have addressed data protection standards and business continuity. So again, it's kind of standards around data compliance, data security and so on. So there's a need for cloud standards because customers value standardization, and they would see it as a good reason to adopt cloud. Perception of the term cloud, we found, was a challenge. So the minute you talk about cloud, it tends to evoke a very, very negative reaction. Insofar that service providers, they don't use the word, the term cloud. They kind of refer to it as a new service delivery model. Another service provider said, if the term cloud wasn't around, would we be better off? So what we're seeing is a younger generation have no problem using the cloud. They'll bank online, they'll leave their laptops on trains, they'll share their passwords. So the younger generation have no problem, but I suppose for the older generation, they don't like the term cloud, and service providers try and not use the term cloud too much. So yeah, so that was kind of interesting. The perception of the term cloud was just something that, as I said, evokes a negative reaction. There's a need for real-world examples. As I said at the very beginning of this presentation, there's a lack of empirical research around cloud computing adoption. We are starting to see some very, very nice case studies around successful cloud adoption, but there is a need for more. So as one public sector body in this case study, what he said was, it would be nice to see more successful stories of cloud adoption, because we as a public service body, we don't want to dip our toe in the water first. We want to see evidence of others that have done it before us, because they're wide open to bad publicity, okay? And they don't want that image of corporate inefficiency if something goes wrong. And public sector bodies in this study, they were very, very interested in the idea of community-based clouds. They refer to some, that are kind of based in the US, but they felt they could really drive down costs if they were to engage with other public sector bodies in community clouds. But yet again, they want to see more real-world examples. So another finding is, once people are educated on how best to govern and manage the cloud process, cloud computing will be more rapidly adopted. So there's a huge lack of educational awareness around security, around privacy. Like, service providers will tell you they've locked down data repositories. They're big on data confidentiality, but nevertheless it's still a concern. And they need to know what the term cloud is and how best to adopt it. So there's a need for more awareness and more training. So just to kind of sum up the presentation, we did find that, cloud computing, it does save time, it saves money, you can streamline your internal processes, you've got scalability, you've got faster implementation time. But one factor that we hadn't found to date in the literature was, as I said, the desire to improve collaboration, internally and externally. So internally, employees want to kind of feel they're a part of something. They want to engage more. They want to be open to more kind of collaboration with other individuals and teams in the organization. Externally, as I said, some of the customers in the study, they really want to engage in community clouds where they can collaborate to drive down costs and, I suppose, improve their whole knowledge base, gain access to knowledge. Security and legal issues highlight the need for educational awareness. Again, service providers, as I said, they just said there tends to be some ignorance around kind of security and so on, that it's not a cloud issue, it's just that there will always be security issues. So many of the issues, what we found is they're not technical as such. There's actually no kind of major cited technological challenges. Many of the issues are psychological or user related. So again, going back to the whole perception of the term cloud, the fact that it scares people was a big one. So for those organizations that are interested in adopting cloud computing on a large scale, they need to prepare employees for this new learning curve. So they need to provide the hand-holding, they need to provide the training. And what we concluded is, giving kind of the role of the IT manager in the future and the changing skill set, we feel that future research really needs to address this. Especially if, IT managers are fearing loss of their jobs and so on. So the responsibilities are changing with cloud adoption. So I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Talking about adoption barriers, you mentioned complexity,
Yes.
which is a known barrier. And I was just wondering whether complexity also didn't arise from the way we see pricing models in the cloud, in the sense that I'm an economist, so I'm not a technician,
Okay.
but very often when we see research about cloud computing, is very often about things like dynamic pricing and prices that evolve all the time, and I mean, consumers, users might perceive that as a form of complexity, in opposition to a set pricing or something like that. So have you seen this as a form of barrier, or?
Well, what's interesting is that we have conducted kind of a lot of studies around business value. And we do know that, often service providers, they kind of get into a war of words with their existing customers, because, they have got service level agreements. And I mentioned in this presentation that They do an awful lot of out-of-office calls and so on. And often customers feel that this should be included, in their pricing model, and it's not. So with a lot of cloud service providers, they don't make this very, very clear, and it does cause confusion. And another customer, they were saying, they want to move more and more kind of data to the cloud, but it's going to incur more and more costs, and they're very, very unsure of what these costs are about. So in terms of service providers' business models, this is something that they need to get right, because they're actually, for two of the service providers in this study, they were actually losing money as a result, because they're so desperate to retain the customer base that they have. And so for some of these smaller service providers, they've got very, very large customers, like Aer Lingus and the police and so on. So they were desperate to retain them. So they actually lost money. So in terms of return on investment, they have to establish a proper return on investment regarding pricing. Does that answer your question?